Hello, my name is Leslene Della-Madre, and I'm going to share with you some thoughts about death and dying and share with you about my book. And first, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about myself and how it came to me to write a book about death and dying. First of all, I've been an independent scholar, and I've studied women's traditions from different parts of the world, and I've done traveling to different sacred sites in the world to try and feel from the earth herself the wisdom of pre-patriarchal cultures, the wisdom of woman-centered cultures, because for the last 5,000 years, we have been under patriarchal rule, which is really male domination. And unless we understand this and realize this, it's very difficult for us to know what it is we need to know about our legacies as women. So in some of the travels that I went on, I visited some places where, like for instance in Malta, where the connection that people had with the cycle of life was very strong, particularly in a town in Malta where we visited a tomb. It's called the Hypogeum, and it's about 3,500 BC. And when it was found by workers, I believe, in the 1930s who were excavating to make apartment buildings or houses or something. And they came across this amazing structure that was filled with red water. And from the elements, the iron and other elements in the water there had made the water red. And it was a burial, not really a ground. It was more like a burial womb space that was made by people over centuries, with antler axes. And they found the remains of about 7,000 people in this womb tomb and bones floating in this red water. So you can imagine what happened to these workers. I mean, at the very least, they must have been completely blown away. And it was discovered that this was a very sacred place to the Neolithic people that had lived there over several millennia. That was one place I got to visit, and I got to be in that space. And it was built down into the earth and about 30 meters or so down into the earth, into the limestone there. And there were carved and excavated rooms, and there's a particular place there called the Holiest of Holies, which is a carved room that looks like a temple. And it was a temple that was carved for the dead. And then there was some iconography found there of females, a woman, a very large-bodied woman laying on her side. And she was like the dream incubator. She was incubating the souls back into new life. And there were still visible paintings in red ochre on the wall and ceiling in one room of, I would call the tree of life with large round red globes, and they probably were pomegranates, symbolic of new life, and the color red is the blood of life, of course. And so just having that one experience in this one place, I realized that in the West, in Euro-Western culture, we are pretty deprived of our teachings and earth-based, woman-based legacies of birth, not only birth, but the passage of death. We've had movements in Euro-Western culture, Europe, and in the United States, Australia, and other places of natural birth movement. And I trained and lived on a place called The Farm in Tennessee, where I did train in midwifery. And we wrote a book called Spiritual Midwifery. And we did the women did a lot of bonding together. There was a lot of sisterhood. We birthed our babies naturally. We helped each other. We developed a school of midwifery. And when I left the farm, after my children had grown up some, and I was caring for my parents, I became inspired about looking into how to midwife death and what does that mean. And this questioning preceded my journeys that I just described, but that question stayed with me, and all my travels fed and nurtured that question. And I felt that the ancestors were looking at me as a vessel to bring forth some of these seeds that were deep in my unconscious. And so in tending to my parents in their passages, I really started to look at what is it that women hold in the secrets, not only birth, but death. How did women in female-centered cultures of the Neolithic and the Paleolithic, how was death regarded? And in this womb tomb that I just described to you, that was what was in the earth. So there was a temple for the living on top of the womb tomb where the dead were buried. So they were in constant communication with the dead. The living and the dead were in constant communication. So my book, Midwifing Death, Returning to the Arms of the Ancient Mother, is very much about the woman-centered cultures of the Neolithic and the ways in which the story has revealed itself through archaeology and archaeomythology. And it's a very, very different view about death and life than what we hold. So I wrote the book to help dispel fear about death and to return it to the wisdom of life itself, which comes from the womb, which is very female, of course. So my exploration is a great view about uncovering that wisdom and reconnecting death and dying to the cycle of life, because life and death are not opposite. And it's not only connecting it to the cycle of life, reconnecting it, but to the entire cycle of beauty, because the cycle of life, the spiral of life, is really about the ecstatic experience of a beautiful cosmos. It's not, from my view, it's not about, as we hear it talked about in science a lot, that there's things crashing around in the universe that are violent. It's violent. It's a violent crashing around. It's a violent whatever. It's not. It's not a violent crashing around. It's an extraordinary, unfolding, orgasmic, birthing experience of creation. And death inside of that view becomes something else entirely.